welcome to the 12th Freethought History Webinar. First up, apologies for the postponement, but I'm glad that you could still make it today. I'm Daniel James Sharp, the editor of the Freethinker. I'm your host this evening. And today we're going to hear from philosopher and historian Matthew Stewart, the author of Nature's Gods, the Heretical Origins of the American Republic, and An Emancipation of the Mind, both of which deal with the influence of radical philosophy on the American Revolution and the abolitionist movement. I hope you had a good 4th of July yesterday, if you celebrated it. I'm sure everyone keenly watched Donald Trump's speech. I think this will be much more interesting, though. So with all that out of the way, I'm simply going to pass over to Matthew and let him take it from here, and hopefully we'll get some time for questions and discussion. So thanks, Matthew, and over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for organizing, Daniel, and I'm very happy to be here. And I have the sense that I shouldn't perhaps monopolize the time with my own talk, because probably many of the people here have strong opinions and a lot of knowledge on the topic we're going to discuss. So I really do want to hopefully leave the bulk of the time for questions and discussion. So the topic of interest is the religious and philosophical heterodoxy of America's founders. You know, the fact that many of them were identified as deists or infidels, or in general associated with the Enlightenment. And I am fundamentally less interested in establishing that fact than in trying to figure out what it means. So, although I will, of course, want to get to the facts, since they are often in dispute on this subject, often unnecessarily so. But for me, the big questions are: what does it mean that America's founders were so heterodox? What does it mean that a nation that has often been represented as being an especially religious one had so many founders who had unconventional religion? And for me, it helps address some fundamental questions about the American Revolution. I've written them down here in my first little thing. I hope this presentation now is up there, just to remind me of what I'm planning to say. So the first fundamental question is how revolutionary was the American Revolution? And as I'm sure many of you know, in the historiography in the past century, there's been a tendency to devalue the revolutionary aspect of the revolution. It's very much in contrast with the view that was taken at the time. And just to play my cards, it's not consistent with my own view. So I want to talk about the revolutionary nature, or the revolutionary aspect of the American Revolution. I want to talk about when it happened, or how we should think about the revolution in time. And again, as a little bit of foreshadowing here, I'm going to talk about a long American Revolution. I might also somewhat inconsistently talk about a first revolution and a second revolution, but I hope we don't split hairs about that. Then there's another question about whether ideas and how ideas really matter. I mean, why should we care what the opinions were of these 18th century individuals? And we're not obligated to do anything just because a founder believed this or that, and they could have believed any number of things that we don't believe now. So how do the ideas matter? How do they matter then? How do they shape the past and lead to the present? And then finally, of course, the big question that we all have to face on days like this: what exactly is the idea of America? And I want to note, by the way, that thanks to our rescheduling, we're doing this on the 5th of July. And since one of my heroes, Frederick Douglass, gave his famous 4th of July speech on the 5th of July speech, I feel this is a sort of good omen for us. All right. Well, I said I wasn't going to go too far into the factual disputes about the founders' beliefs, but I have to address some fundamental issues here. I think many of you are familiar with the Christian nation mythologies that are out there. There are many examples of the falsification of history that go on here. And then there are other examples of a kind of interpretive imposition. My favorite example of a kind of falsification is the one about George Washington kneeling. So in 1818, a Reverend John Snowden said he had spoken to a soldier who 40 years previously had been in, or he'd heard it from someone who knew a soldier who had been in Valley Forge, and allegedly this individual saw George Washington kneeling, and that's what converted him, this soldier, to fight for the American cause. The story was immediately questioned, and it was pretty much retracted at that moment, largely because it was completely inconsistent and had no evidentiary basis. No need to go into the details, but nonetheless, you can't keep a good lie down. So in 1866, the story was so popular that you had a famous painting, which led to many engravings of George Washington kneeling in the snow. The story was so popular that in 1918, a group of people wanted to have a monument put up in Pennsylvania on the spot where the kneeling allegedly took place, and the Park Service investigated. And after a thorough investigation, they said there's just no evidence that this took place or anything like it took place. What's important to add is that not only was Washington known as a deist, but he was kind of infamous in his own time, especially among the ministers, for refusing to kneel in church. So this story isn't just factually dubious, it actually contradicts what we know about Washington. But you can't keep a good lie down. So in 1976, Arnold Freeberg did a famous painting, which now hangs in the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C., showing us once again George Washington kneeling and calling for salvation. I think that provoked some discussion at the time that this is a myth and perhaps we should dispense with it. But fast forward 50 years to our semi-quincentennial, and the White House put out a video where, sure enough, you get the same image, which is taken from an engraving of that first painting. So there's a lot of falsification, but then there's also another story which is not necessarily false, but perhaps raises many interesting questions about the nature of history. And it's the idea that at its founding, the American Republic was in some sense culturally Christian and therefore profoundly shaped or influenced by some civilizational tradition. And that's, in a way, the one that I think we want to address. And then let me just address one other issue on the Christian nation mythology before going into the founders' beliefs, and that's that there's a curious tendency among people who emphasize the Christian or cultural Christian origins of the nation to suppose that this is unambiguously a good thing because it means that presumably they were high and holy and believed in doing good things. But I've wrote a book on the role of philosophy and religion in the struggle over slavery, and I'm sorry, but I can't stress enough the importance of American Christianity in sustaining the slave system. I know the preferred story now is that it was critical to abolition. I think that's far too simple and mostly incorrect. But what is undoubtedly correct is that there was a tremendous amount of support that the slave system derived from American Christianity. And I have here some of many hundreds of sources saying that, but the one I'd like to draw attention to is the last on this slide, which is from Frederick Douglass. The abolitionists were very clear that the church, in their eyes, was the bulwark of slavery, its darkest aspect, and the most difficult to attack. All right, so that's on Christian nationalism and the alternative view. So now let me throw out some facts about America's founders to get discussion going. And as I say, I think many of you will be familiar with these, and you'll know many more facts that are, I think, quite relevant. But I want to try to see if I can pick out a few that address those fundamental questions. So here's the first one, which is, it comes from this story, which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. What happens when you put Thomas Jefferson in a room with a Bible and a pair of scissors? And the answer, of course, is he snips it up and gives us the life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. And he puts out some lines that came back to bite him because these were cited as evidence of his extreme infidelity and bordering on blasphemy and so on in his cavalier treatment of Revelation. So he described his plan as a design to cut out morsels of morality and paste them on the leaves of a book. And he thought these morsels were as easily distinguished as diamonds in a dunghill. But I want to use this to suggest that there is a deeper philosophical position that he's evincing, and that is one can find in throughout America's generation of revolutionaries. And the basic idea is that morality is the essence of all true religion. So it's not just, it's the reverse perhaps of a more common way of thinking, which is that religion is the foundation of morality. So the traditional or common idea is that you need to believe in a deity, otherwise you'll just kind of go out and commit bad deeds. And the Jeffersonian position, which is, I think, associated with the Enlightenment and with deism, in a sense reverses that relationship and says, no, religion is largely epiphenomenal. It's largely just an expression, and often a very somewhat corrupted and inaccurate expression of morality. And of course, once you view morality as the essence of all true religion, all religions end up collapsing into one, essentially a religion of morality. So here's a second theme that, again, I'm sure is going to be familiar to many of you. The Declaration of Independence, of course, famously says that the new republic is entitled to claim its station among the powers of the earth in virtue of the laws of nature and nature's God. So nature's God is fundamental in that declaration, and it's also a central part of Enlightenment and deist discourse. So I thought it was interesting to try to figure out what some of the earliest mentions were of nature's God in North America. And they track very much with the English sources. And one of the earliest, it comes from the Maryland Gazette, 1747. And it's the speech of Miss Polly Baker before a court of judicature in Connecticut. And she was allegedly being prosecuted for the fifth time for having a bastard child, because she apparently couldn't find husbands, and she needed to, she thought it was important to reproduce. She thought it was important to populate the new continent. And there in that article, you find reference to nature's God. I venture, this is Polly Baker speaking to the court. She says, I venture to call it a duty. 'Tis the duty of the first and great command of nature and of nature's God, increase and multiply. And so, of course, Polly Baker is one of Benjamin Franklin's jokes. I thought it's quite humorous. There isn't much doubt that Franklin picked it up from his reading and discussions in London, where he says that he was reading, deist writers like Collins and Shaftesbury. The language about increase and multiply being a command of nature's God can actually be found in the work of Lord Bolingbroke, who was a significant influence on Jefferson. It's probably its most famous reference occurs in Alexander Pope's Essay on Man, and it is, of course, very central to the deist conception. And here again, I want to just suggest, without going too deep into the philosophical morass, that this does involve a distinctive theology, one that's very different from that's associated with most religions, and certainly with most of the many varied forms of American Christianity. And the basic idea is that God and nature ultimately collapse into one another. And God is essentially the way in which we talk about the laws of nature manifesting themselves or acting. Another way to express this is to say that, well, God acts only through these necessary laws of nature. So we'll go farther into that, hopefully, but I think that theology of Polly Baker is an important aspect of the mindset of many of America's founders, the ones that are identified with the Enlightenment. I then want to point out another curious thing about the belief system of many of the founders, and that's that many of them thought there was a high probability of extraterrestrial life. Now, they weren't supposing, by the way, that these aliens were visiting the Earth, and so my little alien drawing here is obviously tongue-in-cheek. The idea was just that the stars must be pretty much like the sun. They must have solar systems. There must be planets out there. There's no reason to think that they don't have life. It's an idea that has a long philosophical prehistory. Among the founders that you can find referencing this idea are Thomas Paine, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, David Rittenhouse, who was the first American astronomer figure, I suppose you could say, Ethan Allen and Thomas Young, two people who figure in my book, Nature's God, and an anonymous writer called A Natural Man, who I identify as Thomas Young in my book, and a number of others. I think that this alien challenge, though, it's quite potent in its context. And by the way, it's not without some power now, because I think I was reading recently that a fair number of evangelicals were getting together to discuss the issue of extraterrestrials, many of them convinced that it would significantly undermine their theologies if this were found to be the case. And I'll mention here just John Adams, who's generally not thought to be among the more radical or heterodox of the founders, as providing an example of this kind of reasoning. He tells us that astronomers tell us with good reason that all the unnumbered worlds that revolve around the fixed stars are inhabited. If so, I ask a Calvinist whether God must assume the respective shapes of all these different species, or else all these beings must be assigned to everlasting perdition. But I think the alien challenge is more than just a kind of challenge to basic revelation. It sets the stage for a political, a rethinking of political theory, because what it tells us is that we are on our own, that the universe doesn't exist to serve human purposes. It's not part of a human narrative. It's there and we're part of it, but we're not special. We have to take charge of our own affairs. And I think that theme runs through many of the founders' works. I'm going to enter on a fourth general theme, which is really a mashup of two themes. The first is that this kind of deism is not just for the, and I'm sorry for the used term here, the fancy founders. I think there's an idea that deism is a kind of elite belief system. It shows up at the America's colleges, famously at Yale, which was characterized as being a kind of hothouse of infidelity, and that it's for the stockings and breeches crowd. But in fact, you can find many people who are involved in the revolutionary project who are not part of that special order, who very much represent different classes in American society, who represent more of a kind of, working resistance against not just British rule, but against some of the elite rule at home. Many people in that group who, in fact, have deist beliefs. And for me, the paradigm of that is Ethan Allen, who wrote his book, Oracles of Reason, and he claimed that he wrote it just from the top of his head, that he only used a Bible and a dictionary. But in fact, much of what it contains duplicates what you find in the deist literature, such as, for example, a book by the very same title written by the English deist Charles Blount in 1693. And as I explained in Nature's God, I think the obvious explanation for that is that Ethan Allen, in fact, got many of his ideas, much of his language, from his friend Thomas Young. And Thomas Young, who was also a representative of these sort of lower working class orders, was widely read in this earlier tradition of deist literature. But I want to suggest that this is the mashup part, that this kind of popularity of deism really reflects an important aspect of its political resonance. So I don't want to suggest that all deists, by the way, had a certain political alignment. There are certainly many who are on the other side of the revolution. Cadwallader Colden, for example, the governor of New York, was a Tory, and at the same time pretty clearly a materialist and a deist. So it's not that there's a one-for-one mapping, but there is a general tendency, and the kind of equal and opposite to the general tendency of Christian nationalism to support slavery and authoritarian systems. Not an absolute connection, but just a proclivity. And I think John Adams, again, paradoxically, the not so radical one, gets at the issue. And this is from a letter to Thomas Jefferson, where he says that the question before the human race is whether the God of nature shall govern the world by his own laws, or whether priests and kings shall rule it by fictitious miracles. Or, in other words, whether authority is originally in the people, or whether it has descended for 1800 years in a succession of popes and bishops, or brought down from heaven by the Holy Ghost in the form of a dove or a vial of holy oil. So this deist conception, as you can see with John Adams, is clearly being used to ground a new political theory whose fundamental claim is that the people are sovereign. So I have this as a fourth teaching that seems to run through much of the founders' work, and it just says that the people, and not an institution, not the government, not a king, nor even a parliament, is the sovereign. The people is the sovereign. Now, I'm going to just leap ahead very quickly to make another extravagant claim, and that's that when you examine the critical figures in the anti-slavery movement, I think you will find that they share much of the same set of philosophical language and preconceptions. And I'll start with Lincoln, who I think is, obviously the central figure in the struggle against slavery, and he is, I think, very much a member of the founding generation in a philosophical sense. So by way of biographical background, he was an avid reader of Thomas Paine. He was an admirer of the Comte de Volney, who was an Enlightenment figure, quite radical, beloved of Jefferson. And in his youth, Lincoln was very much associated with free-thinking radicalism, according to his law partner, William Herndon, though he learned to shut his mouth early. Even so, I argue that his commitment to that same philosophical world of America's founders shows through in many of his most important writings. I have here a sentence from his second inaugural address. I'll skip reading it, but I'm going to suggest that notwithstanding the fact that it's a clear allusion to a certain passage in the Bible, it is in fact a clear reference to the concept of nature's God and its application to the Civil War and the struggle over slavery. And I'll just mention very quickly a second figure. When Lincoln's friends were asked to identify the philosopher, thinker, scholar with whom he most identified and with whom he, that he most studied, the name of Theodore Parker very often comes up. And I think that that's quite reasonable. Many of the phrases that we associate with Lincoln actually started off in Parker's speeches before they found their way into Lincoln's speeches. Government of all, by all, and for all shall not perish from the earth, and a house divided, and so on. Many of these ideas and tropes are found in Parker before they're found in Lincoln. And Parker was very much part of this tradition as well. So now I'm going to turn quickly, and I think I am going to get to an end of this discussion. So I hope you have questions. I've not looked at the chat, but I hope you have something for me. But I want to talk about sources. There's too much here to cover in a short space of time, but I thought I might work backwards just very quickly to kind of give a flavor of where I think some of these ideas come from, and what the earlier genealogy is. Always bearing in mind, by the way, that these figures, just because they read a book and just because they use the language doesn't mean they necessarily got the idea from that source. They often had the idea and they just hunted around for something that confirmed their preconceptions. But one way that I like to illustrate the convergence is to throw up here a list of citations from two different philosophers, in fact. and I invite you to think about who might have written each one. They're all, very humanist. Religion worships man. Religion itself says God is man, man is God. Man everywhere worships man, and the last analysis worships himself. The church we build unto the Lord, we build unto ourselves, and so on. Expressions of, clear humanism that if you happen to read 19th century philosophy texts would sound pretty familiar. And here's the reveal. The marble statue is a bust of Ludwig Feuerbach, a German philosopher from the middle years of the 19th century, who in his day was arguably one of the most famous philosophers and certainly the most famous atheist of the time. And then the other quotes, which frankly sound pretty much the same, come from Frederick Douglass, who, as it turns out, was an avid reader of Feuerbach and, in fact, who owned a bust of Ludwig Feuerbach, which is, in fact, the bust that is pictured here. So this is not to say that Frederick Douglass just got the ideas from Ludwig Feuerbach, but it's to say that he was immersed in a tradition that had this background. Now, where did Feuerbach come from? Well, before we get to that, I'm going to show you another bust that was in Douglass's office, and that's of David Friedrich Strauss. So he's the white bust on the right. And then we've got Theodore Parker. Theodore Parker started off as a Unitarian minister. He then gave a sermon that pretty much ended his career and got him excommunicated from the Unitarians, which is in itself a remarkable feat, I suppose. And the sermon that did it was called A Discourse on the Transient and the Permanent in Christianity. But what you can see if you look at the German title here, Über Vergängliches und Bleibendes im Christentum, is that Parker, cribbed an awful lot of his thinking from David Friedrich Strauss. Who is David Friedrich Strauss? Who is Feuerbach? How are they connected? Well, this is really simplified intellectual history, but Feuerbach himself gives us a pretty strong clue. He says Spinoza is the Moses of the modern freethinkers and materialists. There are, of course, many other figures involved, and I don't think we should, make it Spinoza is just the sort of pivotal figure in history here. But his work is very helpful in explaining the tradition because it's connected to the German tradition that Parker was drawing upon and Douglass was drawing upon, but it's also connected to the English tradition that many of America's earlier founders were drawing upon. And it turns out that many of those things that they drew out in both cases were pretty much the same. So Spinoza, for just to brush up on some of the history, he was excommunicated from his Amsterdam synagogue in 1656 for his abominable opinions and deeds. He published his Tractatus Theologico Politicus in 1670, which was it's a remarkable work, but at the time it was incredibly controversial. So he was described as the most subtle atheist that hell hath vomited on the earth, among many other things. And his posthumous works are central to the subsequent Enlightenment tradition. And very briefly, if I go back to those themes that I suggested are central to the founder's philosophical world, you'll find all of them in Spinoza and then filtering down in different language with subtle variations through a series of other thinkers that have a direct influence on America's founders. So, for example, the first teaching, that morality is the essence of all true religion, is one of the fundamental points that's made in both the Tractatus Theologico Politicus and in the Ethics by Spinoza. Nature's God, or the theology of Polly Baker, again, it's very clearly articulated in Spinoza's Ethics, and then passes from him through a series of English thinkers, John Toland, whose influence I think is quite underappreciated, Bolingbroke, who in turn had a direct influence on Jefferson, Alexander Pope, who got most of his philosophical framing from Bolingbroke, John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, and a number of other figures who then are read and processed and made use of by many of America's founders, and who really provide the kind of substructure of this idea of nature's God. The alien challenge that we're on our own, here I'm linking it to Spinoza, but the truth is that it actually goes back to Epicurus and Giordano Bruno, who really first promoted this idea that we're not alone, and that the universe is probably populated with a whole bunch of creatures like us, that life is everywhere. But Spinoza links that idea to his political theological critique, and I think that the sort of harshest and most direct statement of that appears in the preface to the Tractatus, where he says, and this very much echoes the thinking of John Adams that I cited previously, the supreme mystery of despotism, its prop and stay, is to keep men in a state of deception, and with the specious title of religion to cloak the fear by which they must be held in check, so that they will fight for their servitude as if for salvation. And then finally, on the sovereignty of the people, again, you'll find this in Spinoza. There are subtle variations here, but we can set those aside. Spinoza is one of the first theorists of democracy, and his theory based on the idea that the commonwealth whose laws are based on sound reason is the most free, and the democratic state is the most natural form of state. It's the most free because it approaches most closely to that freedom which nature grants to every man. So, as I say, there's a big genealogy. I can only touch on a little bit here, and even a little bit more, but hardly the whole of it in some of the books that I've written. Some of the names that I think are important, I've already mentioned. I think most people are familiar with the influence of John Locke, but I don't know if people appreciate the extent to which he was immersed in this tradition. Other figures that matter that we've mostly forgotten now are people like Shaftesbury, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, Anthony Collins, and John Toland, Charles Blount, Pierre Bayle, and of course Isaac Newton had an important role to play in spreading many of these ideas. And then these spread among America's founders. Many of the names are familiar to you, but I'll point out that there's a kind of second tier that we don't talk about, who are just as much part of this, like Philippe Freneau and Baudin and many other figures who are, really committed members of the Enlightenment. So that's a quick run through a whole bunch of dirty facts, and I want to now come back to some of the questions and just throw out some provocative suggestions, and I hope, of course, that you'll contradict me or come up with some other ideas and questions. The first suggestion I want to make is that really addresses the question about the role of culture or civilization in an event like the American Revolution. And I want to suggest that the revolutionary part of it is revolutionary in a cultural or civilizational sense, by which I mean that the core ideas of that revolution are not an expression of some pre-existing culture. I think there's a long historiography that often describes the revolution as just the realization or manifestation of certain English ideals, that English believe in liberty and property and things like that, and that the American Revolution simply expresses those earlier ideals. I want to suggest that that's not true fundamentally, that what happened here was that a counter culture of a sort, a revolutionary culture, developed. It developed in Europe mostly, although not entirely. You can argue that there were many other sources in play. And it was precisely because it was deeply at odds with the established tradition that it had this revolutionary impact. I want to suggest that those ideas were necessary, not because you have to, I want to suggest that they're necessary because in order to act in a meaningful way and in a way that changed history, in order for Lincoln, for example, to pursue an anti-slavery project, the philosophy that he made use of and developed was essential, not in telling him that that was the right thing to do, but in clearing away obstacles that might have prevented him seeing that as the right course to pursue. A third point I want to make is that the ideas that powered the Second Revolution, by which I mean mainly the Civil War, and the defeat of slavery were essentially the same ideas that powered the first, which is why I want to suggest that really we should be thinking about the revolutionary project as a long revolution with various iterations. Maybe it just continues. I don't know. It's difficult to say in a way that doesn't sound too fuzzy, but the idea that it all happened in 1776 or between 1776 and 1787, I think, is not accurate. And I want to suggest to back that up, a fourth point, that the idea of America that we now have, I just want to remind everyone, I think it dates in a significant measure from 1865. I mean, that's when you have a part of the Declaration of Independence written into the U.S. Constitution, and that's when you have the idea of universal rights unambiguously embraced, not just in a declaration, but in a formal way as an explanation of what America is about. And a final point is I want to suggest that the ideas that explain the strength of American democracy aren't necessarily the ones that you get if you do a popular opinion survey or if you just try to figure out what it is that Americans believe. That there is some political theory that can explain the success of a system that extends beyond that. And I think that's what's interesting about studying America's political philosophical history and the unusual views of its founders. So I think that's what I had, and I hope I left time for other people to speak. And I'm going to let, should I let Daniel?
Well,
you want me to go through the chats?
yeah, no, thank you. I think we were dealing with some technical troubles in the chat mostly, but there's a question there. But
sorry,
but
I missed that entirely.
I'll jump in if I can actually. I just wanted to ask if you could speak a little bit more about as you put it in Nature's God, that's the essentially atheistic and revolutionary aspect of deism is central to understanding the revolutionary dimension of America. So I don't know if you could go into that a bit more, the atheist part of it. I mean, it seems on the surface it's contradictory, isn't it? Atheism, the atheistic aspect of deism.
Right. So there's a kind of textbook definition of deism, which says, okay, deism is the belief that there is a designer God who, or a supreme architect who just sits down, designs a perfect universe with a solar system and with all the species and so on, and then kind of walks away to the sound of ticking noises. And there's definitely a lot of that kind of discussion among America's founders and among their philosophical precursors. The problem with that description is that it's not an entirely accurate description of that tradition, and it's also not a conception that really lasts very long. And you can kind of see it fall apart within the tradition because at the end of the day, if all God does is design laws of nature and then just make sure that they're executed, there isn't really any functional difference between God and nature. And that's the point that Spinoza makes, kind of conclusively. And that's the point that the critics in the 18th century make against the people who are propounding these deist doctrines. They basically say, either you are promoting some form of, traditional religion, and you're just making your God a watchmaker rather than, the guy who spoke to Moses, or you're just a dishonest atheist. That's what they said at the time, and I think it's largely accurate. And you can see within the tradition how that logic sort of unfolds. I mean, so you have these debates, for example, between Newton and Leibniz, and they both kind of go at each other, really making the same point that hey, you're a deist, but that really means you're an atheist. And of course, neither one wants to be an atheist, but they end up arguing that the other one is. So for Newton, for example, he realizes that if he has God lay out all the laws perfectly, that there's nothing left for God to do. So then he says, oh, well, actually, even if he designs the solar system perfectly, it won't stay in order, it requires too much fine tuning. So God has to step in every now and then to re-regulate it, and just fine tune it, make sure the planets don't go wildly off. And then Leibniz says, oh, so God is like a grease monkey who like designs a defective universe and then has to come in and fix it from time to time. That's no good. That's atheism. So I think that within the history, the deism inevitably slides into atheism. And what the second part of your question is perhaps the more interesting. Why does that matter? Because what the atheistic conception basically says is we're on our own. We are the entities responsible for developing our laws and governing ourselves. The way we govern ourselves is through reason. And if anybody is appealing to some theology, to a deity who allegedly told us something that we just have to accept without question, that we have to accept without evidence, then that person or that group is attempting to govern by mere force and not to allow us to have our freedom, which we can only get through exercising our reason. So, and I think this all comes through very clearly in this tradition, where you can see that the commitment to reason essentially drives these political theorists to remove God in any meaningful way from human governance. So any appeal to a deity as an authority for why we organize government this way, or why we grant these rights and not those rights and so on, all of that gets pushed aside so we can govern ourselves through acts of understanding, through acts of reason. So it's in that sense that atheism is, I think, kind of the fundamental grounding of the American Republic, and it's the fundamental grounding of the modern political order, and I think it's the basis for human freedom. Fundamentally, the attempts to free human beings from their own enslavement, from enslaving one another and enslaving their own minds, generally involve a movement in the direction of atheism, which I guess makes me, kind of a non-religious, irreligious radical, which I'm happy to embrace.
Thank you. I noticed a question earlier in the chat. Jeff Reese asks, and I know you talk about this a bit in Nature's God, actually. Where does Charles Darwin fit into all this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's some tension between the 18th century deists and what will later show up as Darwin, because people like Jefferson, for example, are committed to the idea of fixed species, and he deduces that idea from his deistic reasoning, and it's basically not a very good piece of reasoning, and he ends up kind of losing that argument. So there is some tension, but on the other hand, I would say much more fundamental is the continuity. So Charles Darwin himself was significantly influenced by this earlier philosophical tradition, and philosophers like Spinoza, even though they didn't articulate natural selection or evolution as Darwin understood it, their ideas were certainly very consistent with that. And I'll go even farther and suggest that some of the ancient philosophers, among them I would say Epicurus in particular, in the works of Lucretius, actually puts forward a kind of prototype of the theory of evolution. Right? Yeah, I mean, in Lucretius you'll find references to the idea that things evolve and the stronger survive. And his point is essentially the Darwinian one, that in order to explain the diversity of nature and all the amazing things we see in nature, you don't need to appeal to a designer. You can actually have design arise from the ground up through what's essentially a mechanical or material process.
Thank you. I should just say that if anyone wants to put their hand up, you just use the button and you can ask a question yourself. But we're also in. Oh.
Okay, but you tell me, Daniel, who I should answer here, because I just see a lot of stuff.
Yeah, I've got. Well, yeah, we'll do the couple in the chat first. David Kondo. He says, I spoke with a street evangelist last week while attending Philadelphia's 250th festivities, and a preacher's booklet insisted that the delegates patterned the three-branch government system out of Isaiah 33:22.
Yeah. I mean, it's depressing. I have read through a lot of that stuff. I don't know if you know this figure, David Barton. He's a he calls himself a historian, but even his publisher withdrew one of his books that just had so many incorrect ideas. He is incredibly popular on the right as a propounder of this Christian nation mythology. And if you go through it, you just find all this. It's just schlock history. It's junk. And as I said, I watched this 13-minute video from the White House, and it's also just kind of junk from a history perspective. It says, oh, the idea that America's founders were deists, that's just something that a few popular writers have suggested in recent years, and everybody knows that they're actually true Christians. And it's like, actually, no, pretty much every serious historian has said that the America's founders were part of the Enlightenment tradition, and it's really not controversial, or shouldn't be. And then the next claim is, oh, they never intended to separate church and state. And they say their favorite line seems to be, oh, the separation of church and state is not in the Constitution, which is I don't know what to say other than it's just kind of moronic. I mean, sure, those words aren't in there. That's Jefferson's gloss on what the First Amendment means, and it's a pretty good gloss. It's accurate. It's what they wanted to do. They wanted to separate church and state, and they were unambiguous about it. And that desire to separate, we like to say that it was motivated by a desire to promote religion or to protect their particular variety of religion. And that's probably true in the case of some subset of the founders. But in many cases, in the most important cases, like Thomas Jefferson, who fought for the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, James Madison, George Mason, in those cases, their desire to separate church and state came from this philosophical conception that I'm talking about, which basically says that the foundation of a free political order is one that does not permit any authority to those who claim to speak for a deity. So essentially one that's founded on atheism. So it's the idea that they didn't want to separate church and state is just nonsense looking at the First Amendment and the other debates. But more than that, it's a serious distortion of their philosophical world. Now, true, it's certainly true and fair to say that what the founders wanted and what we ended up getting were two different things. And I think especially if you look at the 19th century republic, as I said, Christianity was fundamental to the slave system. And it was deeply integrated into the American state, and it shows up in a lot of American political practice, even though it's not there in the conception, and it doesn't explain much of anything other than the perpetuation of systems of oppression.
I see Bill Cook has his hand up, so.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, by the way, for your book, The Courtier and the Heretic, which I enjoyed very much.
Okay, thank you.
I want to ask about Joseph Priestley, who got a very sort of marginal thing on your tree of influences there, where Thomas Jefferson speaks of Priestley as one of the few people who really matter in the present age. And whether that's that Socinian type of Christianity, which still saw ethics as essentially a religious idea, but shorn of all the dogma and all the rest of it, is as important and probably more important than the Spinoza radical Enlightenment idea, because it was more acceptable to people generally, because it still had a veneer of Christendom, however radical it was, with that Socinian thing about Jesus as an exemplar man. How important do you think Priestley's impact was on the American Revolution?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the answer that anyone's going to give to that is going to depend on your view about the sort of natural trajectory of liberal religion. Does liberal religion work as a stopping point, or does it necessarily evolve into something else? Priestley was hugely influential on Jefferson. Now, Jefferson went through various enthusiasms, and I think that the Priestley enthusiasm is from the early 1800s mainly. So I don't think that we can say that he was a huge influence on the revolution itself or the immediate years of the revolution, the Declaration. But I think, but afterwards he certainly was. But Jefferson also cycled through some of these, and he particularly latched onto people like Priestley for the reason that you're suggesting, which is that they don't seem to be too far away from the fold. As Socinians, as people committed to the idea that Jesus might have been a man, but a very good man and an exemplar of morality, that's good enough to get you where you want to go in terms of a liberal politics. Yeah. I will say that he's representative of a hugely influential tradition, and Theodore Parker was very much a part of that. However, in the case of Theodore Parker and in the case of many of these others, there was a kind of slippery slope, and whether they managed to sort of hold on to their position as liberal religionists, or essentially ended up sliding back into a more radical form, or into Spinozism, I think that's very much open to question. Parker, for example, starts off very much a Unitarian, which is very consistent with this kind of form of liberal religion, and the morality is the essence of religion. And then step by step, he moves towards a point where he's talking about the God of the philosophers. And it becomes very clear that by the God of the philosophers, he means the God of Spinoza, where nature is God. And then it becomes clear that he kind of identifies with that. And then, of course, he tries to hide it a little bit and so on. But, and this is perhaps the key point, the critics come out, the representatives of Orthodox religion, and they call him out on it. And I think the same thing happened with Priestley. Priestley was a hugely controversial figure. He was pilloried, he was criticized. The Americans ended up really hating him. Many of them did, precisely because they thought of him as on this slippery slope, which, by the way, from what I can remember, I mean, Priestley wrote an unbelievable number of works, but if you look through them, I don't think there's any reason to doubt his sincerity. He was not an atheist, and he was not a radical at all. So it's just a question about the dynamic of the thought. And I think I'll just leave it at that. No question that Priestley, the Unitarians, the liberal religion was hugely influential. It's in some way essential to history, but whether it's the key moving piece or it's just a transition piece, that's a big debate.
Yeah.
Thanks. I see Margaret in the chat asks, how big a role did deism play in France as they embarked on their revolution?
Yeah, so in the historiography, there's a tradition of saying the French were the crazy atheists and the English and Americans were the sort of nice, moderate, friendly deists. I think philosophically that's basically wrong. I think that that's an ex post interpretation that's driven mainly by the interpretation of the French Revolution as a kind of failure that was therefore driven by sort of extreme crazy beliefs. And since the American Revolution was a success and it ended up being relatively religion friendly, its people must have been religion friendly. I think that they were essentially drawing on the same set of philosophical ideas. And I mentioned in Nature's God that Jefferson himself had exactly the same interpretation, the same one I'm offering now. He says, sure, in the Protestant countries like England and America, deism tended to take hold, whereas in the Catholic ones like France, atheism took hold. But then he goes on to say it's mainly a difference of perspective. There are mainly a difference in the way that they conceived of ultimate reality, whether they thought of it primarily in terms of the God side of the dualism or the nature side of the dualism, but it was ultimately the same thing, that they're identifying God and nature. So personally, I think that they're the same. We could go into a lot of the details, but come on, let's remember Thomas Paine. He wasn't nobody. He was there in the American Revolution, and then he shows up in the French Revolution, and sure, he got into trouble, but it wasn't a kind of philosophical trouble. It was political trouble. He worked on the Declaration of the Rights of Man. There's no real suggestion from on the French side that the Americans are off base or that they're radically different. On the contrary, there is this embrace of the American Revolution and an embrace of its radicalism. I mean, Diderot is unambiguous in his support for the American Revolution and seeing it as a world historical event and seeing it as deeply philosophically informed. And then Jefferson, in turn, says the French Revolution is a continuation of the American one. He says that as late as 1795, which is actually after the things really start to go bad in France. So I see those revolutions as being much closer philosophically, even if politically they were very, very different.
That sort of leads me to think about one of the themes of, I think, especially An Emancipation of the Mind, that American history is largely a tale of revolution and counter-revolution, and we can still see that going on today. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about Christian nationalism today, and its relationship to the true founding ideals of the American Revolution, perhaps.
Sorry, I'm sorry. I was just reading something. Apparently, someone felt I didn't answer the question about the reference to Isaiah. I don't remember that specific passage, but I know that there's one in that references Samuel, who as an alleged creator of the idea of republican government, which I don't know if it's connected with this argument or not. But there are many of these arguments, and they involve just a huge amount of cherry picking, because in the Bible, if you read about the treatment of the Amalekites or any of the other stories, you're not going to find an awful lot of democratic political theory. You're going to mainly find the idea that kings get to rule and kings get to kill whoever they want. But you can always cherry pick, and you can always find something that suggests the alternative, then you can make a meal out of it. But I'm sorry, you had another question there, Daniel?
Yeah, I was just asking about the history of revolution and counter-revolution throughout American history, and if you could talk a little bit about where we are today with this renewed Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I think it's really important to accept that revolutions just don't decide everything forever. They mark a crucial moment. They mark an important switch that happens at a certain time, but they can be very quickly reversed, and they have been throughout American history. And really, from the moment that the American Revolution happened, you started to see counter-revolutionary forces working the other way. And one episode that I think is not sufficiently appreciated, that I try to draw attention to in Nature's God, is the Pennsylvania Revolution. So in 1776, there were some real radicals running Pennsylvania politics, or having huge influence. Thomas Paine, but also Thomas Young, James Matlack, and a few others. And these people didn't just want to separate from Great Britain. They wanted to have a new form of government in Pennsylvania, a much more democratic form of government. And they organized a revolution, an internal revolution that produced a new constitution. In 1776, that turned out to be crucial for the American Declaration of Independence. But then, almost immediately, within a year, you had a counter-revolution in Pennsylvania, where the people with land and property and power said, wait a minute, this is getting out of hand. We don't want this universal suffrage thing, and we don't want to have people without property getting involved, and we don't want to have too much democracy. And so they started to reverse that, and they came up with a new and more regressive constitution. And that's a minor example. A much more serious example was the sort of vengeance of the slave states in leading a counter-revolution. And then also, you could say, a linked counter-revolution in the North among the emerging industrialist class, who were pretty keen to keep democracy at bay while they accumulated power and wealth.
All right. Well, I think we're just about at the hour now, so I think that's probably a good place to end it.
Okay.
I'd just like to say thank you again to Matthew, and apologies again to everyone for the postponement from earlier this week. But I'm glad we got here in the end. Do check out Matthew's books if you haven't; they're very good. And do also check out the Freethinker, freethinker.co.uk.
New book coming out. I don't know if you could see this.
Oh, there we go.
Okay.
New book. There we go.
In November.
All right. But yeah, thank you everyone, and thanks Matthew, and have a lovely rest of your evening.
All
or
right.
afternoon.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for organizing, Daniel. I appreciate it.
Thank you.